Do you have any idea what you've done? The judge's voice thundered through the courtroom, bouncing off the high ceilings like a hammer striking steel. Her eyes burned with fury as she glared down at the two uniformed officers before her. They sat frozen, their faces pale, their hands gripping the table as if it were the only thing keeping them upright. The gavel slammed down once, twice. The room held its breath. But justice, real justice, was only just beginning. Hours earlier, the afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across Westfield Park, where families enjoyed the late summer breeze. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant laughter of children chasing a frisbee. Near the lake, under the shade of an old maple tree, Daniela Moore sat alone on a wooden bench, flipping through the pages of a thick hardcover book. For her, this moment was rare, an escape from the weight of the courtroom, from the never-ending cascade of cases that blurred together in a stream of bureaucracy and broken lives. Here, in the open air, with the rhythmic rustling of leaves overhead, she could breathe. That was, until the sound of approaching sirens shattered the stillness. A police cruiser skidded to a stop near the curb. Two officers stepped out, their movements sharp, methodical, hunters spotting their prey. "Ma'am, can we have a word?" One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, spoke first. His badge gleamed under the sunlight. His name tag read Randall. Daniela glanced up from her book, brows slightly furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" The second officer, a younger man with a stiff stance, scanned the area as if expecting to find something, anything, to justify their approach. His name tag read Miller. "We received a report of suspicious activity in the park," Randall said, crossing his arms. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Daniela blinked. Suspicious activity? She looked around, seeing nothing but joggers, picnicking families, an elderly couple feeding ducks by the water. "I'm reading," she said simply, lifting her book as if they might need proof. Randall exchanged a glance with Miller. "Can we see some ID?" Her fingers instinctively tightened around the cover of her book. For what reason? Her voice remained steady, but a flicker of something darker brewed beneath it. Miller's hand hovered over his belt, near his holster. Just routine. Allah. She knew it. They knew it. Nearby, a small crowd had begun to gather, their whispers threading through the air like an uneasy wind. A teenage boy with a phone camera already recording took a step closer. Daniela inhaled slowly. "I know my rights. If I'm not being detained, I'd like to continue my afternoon in peace." But peace was never part of their plan. Randall took a deliberate step forward. "Are you refusing to comply?" His voice was laced with that dangerous tone, one designed to escalate. "I'm refusing to be harassed," she countered. His fingers twitched, and then, in one practiced motion, he grabbed her wrist. "You're resisting." The handcuffs snapped shut before she could utter another word. The murmurs from the crowd swelled into outrage. The teenage boy pushed forward, his camera now inches from Randall's face. She didn't do anything. Daniela exhaled sharply, steadying herself as they yanked her toward the cruiser. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into her skin, but the fire in her chest burned hotter. As they shoved her into the back seat, she turned her gaze toward the onlookers, toward the cameras. "Film everything." Her voice, calm yet unbreakable, carried through the chaos. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The air inside the police station was thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee and sweat, an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to the walls. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glow over the dull gray interior. The entire place felt like a cage, not just for those behind the bars, but for everyone who had ever passed through its doors. Daniela sat on a cold metal bench, her wrists still locked in steel cuffs. The skin beneath them throbbed, raw from the tight restraint, but physical discomfort was nothing compared to the slow-burning fire building inside her. She stared straight ahead, seeing nothing but the injustice that had just unfolded, the weight of it pressing down on her like a slow suffocation. Officer Randall stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his stance casual but watchful. There was something unsettling in the way he observed her, not just with authority, but with that quiet, unshakable arrogance that came with knowing he held power over people. "You act like you're someone important," he mused, tilting his head slightly, his voice laced with something close to amusement. "But right now, you're just another perp sitting and holding." Daniela turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. "If I were you, I'd pay closer attention to the names on your arrest reports, she said, her voice even but sharp as a blade. Randall smirked, but there was the faintest flicker of something else in his eyes. Uncertainty, irritation. The desk sergeant, an older man with thick-rimmed glasses and a permanent scowl, typed lazily at his computer, his fingers tapping against the worn-out keyboard. The sound filled the silence like a ticking clock. Date of birth, he asked, not bothering to look up. Daniela exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. Are you serious? The sergeant finally glanced up, his expression impassive. He wasn't used to people questioning him. He was used to compliance, to people being too scared or too exhausted to push back. Daniela wasn't like them. She wasn't here to be broken. Date of birth, he repeated, more impatient this time. She gave him the information, watching as he entered it into the system. The moment felt surreal, like watching a movie in which she had been cast against her will, trapped in a scene she had no business being a part of. Across the room, Officer Miller stood near the entrance, eyes downcast, flipping through a report he wasn't really reading. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. His fingers twitched slightly as he turned a page. The tension in the air thickened. Then the station doors swung open. A tall woman in a sleek black suit strode inside, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with purpose. Her presence alone shifted the energy in the room, like a sudden drop in temperature before a storm. Release her, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. Randall turned toward her, his body language instantly rigid. A lawyer, he muttered, his smirk returning. That was fast. The woman's sharp brown eyes didn't waver. Faster than you'll be able to explain this arrest in court, she shot back. It was Lisa Harper, Daniela's longtime colleague, one of the most formidable defense attorneys in the state. She wasn't just here to get her friend out. She was here to make sure every single person in that room regretted what had just happened. The desk sergeant hesitated, glancing at his screen. His expression shifted. She's clear, he grumbled. She can go. Randall clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. Moments later, the cuffs were unlocked, the cold metal sliding away from Daniela's wrists. She massaged the red indentations on her skin, standing slowly. She didn't rush. She made sure to lock eyes with Randall before she spoke. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, she said, her voice quiet but charged with something undeniable. Randall stared back at her, his expression unreadable. Lisa touched Daniela's arm, steering her toward the exit. The night air outside felt sharp against her skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside the station. But the tightness in her chest remained. Even as she took her first breath of freedom, she knew this wasn't over. They got into Lisa's car, the hum of the engine filling the silence as they pulled onto the road. This isn't the end, Daniela said finally, her voice steady. Lisa glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her gaze assessing. No, she agreed. It's just the beginning. Daniela pulled out her phone. Missed calls. Dozens of notifications. Then she saw a link. A video. The video. The one taken in the park. It had already gone viral. And nothing would ever be the same again. The glow of the phone screen illuminated Daniela's face as she scrolled through the endless flood of comments, reposts, and news articles. The video had spread like wildfire. Millions of views, thousands of shares. Every major platform had picked it up. The headline was everywhere. Black woman harassed and arrested for reading in a park. But the world didn't yet know the full story. Daniela exhaled, setting the phone down on the dashboard. The weight of it all pressed against her ribs like a vice. Lisa kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but was thick with unspoken thoughts. They don't know who you are yet, Lisa said finally, her voice measured, careful. Not yet, Daniela murmured. The realization settled between them. It was one thing for a video of an unjust arrest to go viral. It was another for the world to find out that the woman in the footage, the one shoved into the back of a squad car, humiliated, treated like a criminal, was a judge. That revelation would change everything. Outside the window, the city blurred past in a streak of streetlights and neon signs. Daniela could already see the chain reaction unfolding. Reporters scrambling for information, activists demanding justice, lawyers whispering in back rooms about what this could mean for the legal system. And then there were the officers, the ones who had put her in cuffs, who had stared her down with the certainty that she was powerless against them. They had no idea what was coming. Lisa pulled into the underground parking garage beneath Daniela's apartment building. The hum of the engine cut out, leaving only the distant echoes of the city above. "Are you ready for this?" Lisa asked, turning to look at her. Daniela ran a hand through her hair, pressing her fingers into her scalp as if grounding herself. "I don't have a choice," she said. They stepped out of the car, their heels clicking against the concrete as they made their way toward the elevator. The tension in Daniela's body hadn't eased, but there was something else beneath it now, something sharper. Determination. The apartment was dark when they entered, the only light coming from the city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Daniela tossed her bag onto the counter and walked straight to the kitchen, pulling a glass from the cabinet. The tap water was cold against her lips, but it did nothing to wash away the bitter taste in her mouth. Lisa leaned against the counter, watching her. "You know they're going to try to bury this," Lisa said. "Damage control. They'll spin it, say it was a misunderstanding, make excuses. Maybe they'll even offer you a quiet settlement just to make it all disappear." Daniela set the glass down harder than she intended. The thought of it made her stomach turn. "They can try," she said, "but I'm not letting this slide." Lisa studied her for a long moment. "You've been fighting battles your whole life," she said, "but this one's different." Daniela knew she was right. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't another courtroom argument where logic and evidence would decide the outcome. This was a public reckoning, and once the truth was out, there would be no going back. She turned away from the kitchen, heading toward the living room. Her laptop sat on the coffee table, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and case files. The work never stopped. But tonight, the case she was about to build was personal. She opened her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard for just a moment before she started typing. A formal complaint. A lawsuit. A demand for accountability. She had spent years standing behind a bench, listening to victims, weighing facts, delivering justice. Now she was the one seeking it. Lisa sat on the couch across from her, arms crossed. "You know this means war, right?" Daniela didn't look up. It already was. The hours passed in a blur of legal research, drafted motions, and calls to trusted colleagues. Every new message, every email, every notification only fueled the fire burning inside her. People were reaching out, journalists, civil rights groups, attorneys who wanted to help. The video had struck a nerve, and the world was watching. But Daniela wasn't just building a case against the officers who arrested her. She was preparing for what came next. By morning, her inbox was flooded. News stations wanted statements. Activists wanted her to speak at rallies. Her law firm, predictably, was panicking. And then the call came. Lisa answered first, but Daniela could hear the tension in her voice before she even passed the phone over. "It's the chief of police," Lisa said, her expression unreadable. Daniela took the phone, pressing it to her ear. "Judge Moore," the voice on the other end said, strained and calculated. "I believe we need to have a conversation." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "We do." The world was about to change, and she was going to make sure it did. The weight of the phone pressed against Daniela's palm, but she remained still, letting the silence stretch between her and the police chief on the other end of the line. His voice had been measured, controlled, but there was something else beneath it, a strain, the sound of a man trying to keep a situation from spiraling. Lisa watched her carefully from across the room, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Daniela didn't need to see her to know what she was thinking. This wasn't a courtesy call. This was an attempt at damage control. She let the chief wait a moment longer before she finally spoke. "I assume you're not calling to apologize." A sigh came through the receiver. Not an exhale of regret, but of restraint. "I understand that you're upset, Judge Moore," he said, his voice flat. "This situation has escalated faster than anyone anticipated." Daniela glanced at her laptop screen, where the viral video was still open. Millions of views, tens of thousands of comments. The world had seen her being treated like nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of two men who had no idea who they were dealing with. "No," she said, her voice even. "This situation is unfolding exactly as it should." The chief hesitated, and Daniela could hear the faint tapping of his fingers against his desk. He was choosing his words carefully. "There are a lot of eyes on this now," he finally said. A lot of people looking for someone to blame. She knew what he was doing. He wanted her to believe they were on the same side, that they both wanted this to disappear quietly. But she wasn't interested in quiet. "What do you want, Chief?" she asked, cutting through the pleasantries. "A conversation," he said. "Before this turns into something bigger than it needs to be." Daniela let that sit for a moment, rolling his words over in her mind. "I think we passed that point the moment your officers put me in handcuffs," she said finally. Another sigh, this one heavier. "Look, Judge, we both know how these things go," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "Things escalate, people take sides, and at the end of the day, nobody wins. But if we work together, we can get ahead of this. We can find a way forward." A way forward. That was code for sweeping it under the rug, for a carefully worded press release, for an internal review that would lead to nothing. Daniela had seen it happen too many times before. "I don't need to work together with you, Chief," she said. "I need justice." The silence that followed was heavier than before. She had given her answer. "I see," the chief finally said. "Then I guess I'll see you in court." The line went dead. Daniela lowered the phone and set it on the table. Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. "They're nervous," Lisa said. "They should be." Daniela leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the city's skyline. She could feel the shift in the air, the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The legal system thrived on order, on quiet deals and backroom compromises. But this wasn't going to be quiet. This was going to be loud. The next few days passed in a blur of legal briefings, media calls, and strategy meetings. Daniela barely had a moment to herself, but she thrived in the chaos. Every email, every message, every interview request only fueled her. The city was watching, and she was determined not to let this moment slip through the cracks. Randall and Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but she knew how these things worked. The police department would stall, waiting for public outrage to die down. They would talk about policy reviews, diversity training, anything to shift the focus away from real accountability. She wasn't going to let that happen. Lisa sat across from her at the conference table, scrolling through the latest updates. "The mayor's office put out a statement this morning," Lisa said, tapping her phone. "They're calling it a regrettable misunderstanding." Daniela scoffed, shaking her head. "That's what they always call it," she said. "Until it happens again." Lisa set her phone down, looking at her carefully. "You know, this is going to get ugly," she said. "They're already digging into your past, looking for anything they can use against you." Daniela wasn't surprised. It was standard procedure. When the system was threatened, it always fought back. "They won't find anything," she said. "They don't need to," Lisa countered. "They just need a distraction." Daniela knew she was right. It was only a matter of time before the department tried to turn the narrative against her. They would paint her as aggressive, difficult, a woman who overreacted. They would frame her as the problem, not the officers who arrested her. It was predictable. And it wasn't going to work. She stood, stretching her arms before walking to the window. The city moved below her, unaware of the battle being waged in courtrooms and newsrooms alike. "They think they can wait this out," Daniela said. "They think if they stall long enough, people will forget." Lisa leaned back in her chair. "But you won't let them," she said. Daniela turned back to her, a quiet fire in her eyes. "No," she said. "I won't." She picked up her phone, scrolling through her messages until she found the one she was looking for. A reporter from one of the biggest news outlets in the country had been reaching out for days. It was time to give them a story. The news broke that evening. Judge Daniela Moore speaks out against corrupt policing practices. Her face was plastered across the headlines. Clips of her arrest played on repeat. The weight of her words echoed through television screens and social media feeds. The city had officially turned its attention to the case. And in a dimly lit office across town, two police officers sat in silence, watching the screen as their faces appeared alongside hers. Randall exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Miller just stared. Neither of them spoke. Because for the first time since they put those handcuffs on her, they finally understood. This wasn't going away. And they were in real trouble. The weight of the moment was suffocating. The city had turned its eyes toward the case, and there was no escaping the scrutiny that came with it. Every news outlet, every social media post, every whispered conversation in legal circles revolved around the video, the arrest, and most importantly, the woman at the center of it all, Judge Daniela Moore. The police department scrambled to control the damage. Their PR team carefully crafted statements that danced around responsibility without ever admitting fault. They promised a full investigation, reassured the public that all necessary steps were being taken. But those words were meaningless. Daniela had seen this exact playbook too many times before. The system was designed to protect itself. The only difference now was that she wasn't just another victim swept under the rug. She was a judge, and the public was watching. News crews camped outside the courthouse, waiting for a statement. Protesters gathered with signs demanding justice, their voices rising in chants that echoed down the city streets. The air was charged with something more than anger. It was determination, a collective refusal to let this story fade into yet another forgotten case of injustice. Inside her office, Daniela stood by the window, staring down at the crowd. The energy was palpable, almost electric. The people outside weren't just fighting for her. They were fighting for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or brutalized by a system that was supposed to protect them. Lisa sat at the conference table, scrolling through legal briefs, her expression tense. The noise from outside seeped into the room, a constant reminder that time was running out. They're pushing for a closed hearing, Lisa said, setting her phone down. They're hoping to minimize media attention. Daniela exhaled slowly. It was a predictable move. If the case played out behind closed doors, the department could spin whatever narrative they wanted. The officers might face nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and public outrage would eventually fade. That wasn't going to happen. They don't get to control the story this time, Daniela said, her voice steady. Lisa nodded, but there was something else in her expression, something unreadable. They know you're the judge assigned to their misconduct hearing, she said carefully. Daniela turned from the window, her heartbeat quickening just slightly. They know. Lisa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. It leaked, she said. The media hasn't picked up on it yet, but the department knows. Randall and Miller know. A slow, heavy silence settled between them. Daniela processed the weight of those words. The very men who had unlawfully arrested her, who had humiliated her, treated her as less than, were now set to stand trial in her courtroom. A twist of fate that no one had seen coming. Lisa studied her, waiting for a reaction. You could recuse yourself, she said finally. No one would blame you. Daniela considered it. Ethically, a judge was expected to remain impartial, and personal involvement in a case was grounds for stepping away. But this wasn't just personal. It was systemic. If she recused herself, another judge, one who might not feel the same urgency, the same weight of responsibility, would take over. She had seen too many cases where justice had been a formality rather than a reality. She wouldn't let that happen here. No, she said. I'm staying on. Lisa didn't argue. She just nodded once, as if she had already known that was the answer. Daniela turned back to the window. The crowd outside had grown, their voices rising in unified defiance. Somewhere in that sea of people, she knew there were faces she would never see, people who had been wronged and never received justice. This case wasn't about her. It was about all of them. She had spent her career upholding the law. Now it was time to make sure the law upheld its promise. The next morning, the tension inside the courtroom was suffocating. It wasn't a high-profile trial, not in the traditional sense. No celebrity scandals, no murder investigations. But the weight of the moment was undeniable. The city's most powerful officials had shown up, sitting in the gallery with their polished suits and carefully blank expressions. Reporters whispered among themselves, their pens poised, waiting for the moment when the hearing would begin. And then the door opened. Randall and Miller walked in, their uniforms neatly pressed, their faces carefully neutral. They had been through hearings before, internal reviews that were nothing more than formalities. They had walked away and scathed every time. But this time was different. The moment they looked up and saw who was sitting at the judge's bench, their composure faltered. Daniela sat with perfect poise, her robe draped over her shoulders, her expression unreadable. The shift in their demeanor was subtle, but undeniable. Randall stiffened, his jaw tightening just slightly. Miller blinked twice, his hands curling into fists before he forced them to relax. They hadn't expected this. Neither had their attorney, who quickly whispered something to them, likely telling them to keep their reactions under control. Daniela let the silence stretch for a moment longer before she picked up her gavel. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice steady, powerful. She saw the way Randall shifted in his seat, how Miller swallowed hard. For the first time, they were on the other side of the bench. For the first time, they weren't in control. The prosecutor stood, beginning his opening statement, laying out the facts in a methodical, unemotional tone. The video was played on the screen, once again showing the moment when Randall grabbed her arm, when the cuff snapped around her wrists. The audio echoed through the courtroom, the voices clear. "She was resisting. Just doing our job." Randall and Miller sat motionless, watching their own actions played back for the room to see. Daniela didn't react. She remained composed, professional. But deep inside, she felt the weight of it all, the gravity of the moment, the sheer irony of the situation. They had taken her freedom without a second thought. Now it was her turn to decide theirs. And justice would have no exceptions. The courtroom remained silent long after the video ended, the echoes of those words. She was resisting, lingering in the air like an unshakable presence. Every person in the room had just witnessed the moment when two officers had taken an innocent woman and turned her into a suspect, not because of her actions, but because of their own ingrained assumptions. Daniela kept her face unreadable, her expression composed as she turned the weight of her gaze onto the two officers before her. Randall avoided her eyes entirely, staring at the table in front of him, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed at his temple. Miller, on the other hand, kept shifting in his seat, his discomfort plain for everyone to see. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. The prosecutor resumed speaking, his voice steady as he outlined the charges. Excessive force, unlawful detainment, conduct unbecoming of an officer. The words carried weight, but the real impact came from the evidence itself. The video had already convicted them in the court of public opinion. Now it was time to see if the law would do the same. Daniela listened intently, making notes as the case unfolded. She had seen hundreds of cases like this before, had watched too many officers walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. But she wouldn't let herself think about that now. She had to remain impartial. Or at least, she had to appear impartial. The defense attorney finally rose to speak, his voice measured, his tone calculated. He was experienced, the kind of lawyer who specialized in cleaning up messes like this. He painted a picture of two officers simply doing their jobs, responding to a call, trying to maintain order. He leaned into the uncertainty, into the gray areas of perception and intent. What my clients saw that day, he said, pacing slowly, was a situation that required their intervention. A lone individual in a public space, fitting the vague description of a potential suspect. They followed protocol. They requested identification. And when they were met with resistance, Daniela's fingers twitched slightly at the word, but she remained still. They took action to secure the situation. That is what they are trained to do. The argument was familiar. A justification, wrapped in official language, meant to sanitize the reality of what had happened. But there was no sanitizing the video. The jury, if this had been a full criminal trial, would have seen through it in seconds. And yet, the law didn't always work that way. The courtroom felt heavier with every passing minute. Witnesses were called, including a few civilians who had been in the park that day. They described what they had seen, the confusion, the fear, the moment when the officers escalated a peaceful encounter into something much darker. Their voices were steady, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, an exhaustion, a frustration that spoke to the fact that this wasn't new. It had happened before. It would happen again. Then it was time for the officers to speak. Miller went first. His hands gripped the edge of the table as he was sworn in, his throat bobbing as he swallowed nervously. He answered the questions carefully, his voice restrained. He explained his actions, his decisions, the way he had followed Randall's lead. But there was something in his tone, hesitation, regret. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. "Do you believe," the prosecutor asked, "that your actions that day were justified?" A long pause. Miller's gaze flickered toward Randall before he finally exhaled. At the time, he said slowly, "I thought they were. But looking back, I could have handled it differently." The words were small, but they landed heavily in the room. An admission, Not a full confession, but the closest thing to one that anyone was going to get. Randall, however, was different. When he took the stand, his posture was rigid, his expression cold. He didn't waver, didn't hesitate. He stood by his actions, deflected blame, shifted the narrative back to the idea that they had simply followed protocol. The situation could have escalated, he said at one point. We took appropriate measures to prevent that. You arrested a woman for reading in a park. The prosecutor shot back. At what point did that situation escalate? Randall's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The room felt charged, an invisible tension stretching between everyone present. Daniela watched closely, taking in every detail. She had expected this from Randall. He was the kind of officer who never saw himself as the problem. To him, this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about control. He had lost it, and now he was trying to take it back. But that wasn't going to happen. As the hearing progressed, Daniela found herself studying the faces in the room. The city officials, the other officers who had come to observe, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. There was something different about this case, something undeniable. The system had always protected officers like Randall and Miller. It had always given them an out, a way to justify their actions, to make sure that accountability never truly landed on their shoulders. But this time, the world was watching. She glanced toward the gallery, her eyes landing on a young woman holding a notepad. A journalist. Daniela recognized her. She had been covering the case from the beginning. And that was when Daniela realized something. Even if the department tried to spin this, even if they pulled every string they had, the truth had already been set loose. The people outside the courthouse, the voices demanding justice, the ones who had seen the video and refused to look away, they weren't going to let this be buried. And neither was she. As the closing arguments began, Daniela leaned back slightly in her chair, steadying herself for what came next. The evidence had been presented. The words had been spoken. Now it was time for a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of this courtroom, a decision that would define what justice truly looked like. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The weight of the moment pressed down on Daniela's shoulders, but she didn't let it show. She had spent years mastering the art of control, on the bench, in the courtroom, even in the face of injustice. She gripped her pen lightly, running her fingers over the cool metal as the final words of the closing argument settled into the thick silence. The prosecution had made its case. The video evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable reality that the officers had escalated a situation that never should have been an incident in the first place. The defense, in turn, had done exactly what was expected. They had leaned on policy, on vague claims of protocol, on the idea that law enforcement must make difficult, split-second decisions. But there had been no split-second decision that day. Randall and Miller had approached her with purpose. They had decided who she was before she even had a chance to speak. That wasn't policing. That was prejudice in its most recognizable form. She looked down at her notes. They were methodical, filled with legal precedents and references that could easily support her ruling. But she didn't need them. She knew exactly what she was going to say. She picked up her gavel and tapped it once. The murmurs in the courtroom ceased immediately. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the arguments from both sides, she began, her voice steady. The facts of this case are clear. The officers in question engaged in an unlawful detention, utilizing force under the pretense of routine policing, despite the absence of any legitimate threat. She let her words settle, watching as Randall shifted slightly in his chair. He still held his composure, his mask of indifference, but there was something else there now, a tightness in his shoulders, the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. Miller, on the other hand, was visibly affected. His hands were clasped together, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The law is not meant to be used as a weapon against the innocent, she continued. Yet, too often, we have seen the very systems designed to protect our communities fail the people they serve. What happened in that park was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a larger issue, one that cannot be ignored. She saw movement from the corner of her eye. The journalists in the gallery furiously scribbling notes, the reporters exchanging glances. They knew this moment was bigger than just a hearing. The officers' actions were not just unjustified, she said, her tone unwavering. They were a violation of the fundamental principles of justice itself. She turned her gaze toward the defense table, where the two officers sat. "Officer Miller," she said, addressing him first. He lifted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You have admitted that you could have handled the situation differently. While that admission does not absolve your actions, it does indicate an awareness of the harm caused. The court takes that into consideration." She paused before turning to Randall. "Officer Randall," she continued, her voice measured. "At every stage of these proceedings, you have maintained that your actions were justified, that you did what you believed was necessary." She held his gaze. The evidence, however, contradicts that claim. Randall's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "This court finds Officer Miller guilty of misconduct and dereliction of duty," she stated firmly. "He will be suspended from duty without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining before any consideration for reinstatement." Miller inhaled sharply, but he nodded, accepting the decision. She shifted her attention back to Randall. "Officer Randall," she said, "this court finds you guilty of excessive force, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Randall sat stiffly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. For the first time, his confidence wavered. "Due to the severity of your actions and the clear disregard for protocol and public trust, this court recommends immediate termination of employment and formal charges for civil rights violations." Randall's head snapped up. His attorney leaned in quickly, whispering to him, but Daniela kept her focus. "This is not about personal bias," she said. "This is about accountability. The law applies to everyone equally, and no badge grants immunity from justice." The sound of her gavel striking the bench signaled the end of the hearing, but the impact of her ruling was only just beginning. The courtroom erupted into noise, some voices raised in approval, others in outrage. Reporters rushed toward the exit, eager to be the first to break the news. Miller sat frozen, while Randall's attorney was already talking about appeals. Daniela remained still, watching the scene unfold. She had done what needed to be done. As she gathered her notes, she felt a presence near her. She looked up to see Miller standing in front of the bench. "I just wanted to say," he hesitated, his voice quieter now. "I was wrong. I see that now." Daniela studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then do better," she said simply. Miller gave a small nod before turning to leave. Randall, on the other hand, walked out without looking back. The weight in Daniela's chest remained, but as she stepped out of the courtroom, the sound of protesters outside reached her ears. Their voices were strong, unwavering. This wasn't just about one case. This was about change, and it was only the beginning.